I asked the waiter to bring the divorce papers to my wife's table while she kissed her lover, and she didn't even notice me across the room. She signed her betrayal, unaware that there she was also signing the end. I got up silently and left, lightly for the last time. She only discovered the note when the waiter handed her the folder and whispered, "It's from your husband." Her lover disappeared soon after, making it clear he didn't want anything serious. Alone, she tried to find me days later, but I was already elsewhere, more serene, with someone who chooses me every day, without games or lies. When we finally spoke, I offered what was left, forgiveness. But not to start over with her, just to end in peace. Each followed their own path, and she then realized that the choice she had made had thrown away a sincere love. It's not easy to explain the exact moment a heart breaks. Most people think the burst is like an explosion, a scream, a cry, a scene. But for me, it was different. When I saw my wife smiling with another man in the same place where she promised me eternal love, there was no scandal, no noise. Just a deafening silence that pierced me like a cold razor. She laughed at something he whispered in her ear, tossed her hair back like she did with me in those early years, and held his hand on the table as if holding a certainty. The world went on around me, waiters coming and going, silverware clinking on plates, people toasting, while inside me, everything stopped, everything slowly crumbled. It wasn't a shock. It was a confirmation. I knew before I saw. Sometimes the body feels what the eyes haven't yet seen. The delay in messages, the coldness in the touch, the automatic apologies. But there's always a part of us that clings to the most foolish hope, that we're exaggerating, that love still lives, even when wounded. But there, in that restaurant, the disguise fell. And she didn't even notice. He didn't even look around. He was so lost in the other that he didn't even notice the man he'd shared a life with sitting a few feet away, his heart shattered in his hands. The waiter hesitated as he took the folder, looking at me as if to ask without saying anything, "Are you sure?" I was. For the first time in months, I was certain of something. And that certainty didn't hurt. It relieved. Signing the divorce at that moment wasn't an act of revenge. It was liberation. I didn't want her to suffer what she'd made me suffer. I just wanted her to know what she'd lost. To understand, at least for a moment, the enormity of the mistake she'd made. She laughed. And as she laughed, she unknowingly gave me the final signal that it was over. That there was no turning back. That I'd done everything I could. The waiter walked toward her with slow steps. She was still holding hands with her lover. He caressed her wrist as if it were already his. The folder was left on the table with a short, almost whispered phrase, "It's your husband's." I don't know how she reacted, she didn't want to look back. When I walked through the restaurant door, for the first time in years, I breathed without the weight of doubt, anguish, and waiting. And for the last time, my body felt light. Not because I'd won. But because I'd let go of what was no longer mine. Days later, the phone rang late at night. She wanted to talk. I didn't answer. Life has its own way of answering questions that words can't. She persisted. Texts, emails, even a handwritten letter, just like old times. She said she needed to see me, that she'd made a mistake, that it was all an impulse, that she still loved me, that she never stopped loving me, that she was just confused, that it meant nothing, that it was just a kiss, that the other person was nothing, that she wanted to try again. Too many words for someone who kept quiet when I needed them most. Words that might have once made me stay. But now they had nowhere to land. I was no longer the same man. Love, when it leaves and takes everything with it, leaves no cracks. It leaves scars. She cried. She said she regretted it. That she didn't know what she was doing. That she only realized it when she lost it. That seeing that folder was like falling from a falling building. That she felt exposed, alone, abandoned. I listened to it all. Silent. I let her speak. As if, by listening, I could give her what was left, not of our love, but of my compassion. When she finished, she told me to forgive me for not being enough, that she understood if I never wanted to see her again. And there, at that point, it was my turn to speak. She said she already had forgiveness. But not to start over. To close. Because true forgiveness isn't an invitation back. It's a bridge to leaving in peace. She asked for another chance. She said she wanted to fix it. But there are things that, once broken, never come back together. Love isn't glass. It's porcelain. It breaks invisibly, fragments from within. You can glue it back together, yes. But it will never be the same. The shine fades. The touch changes. And every time you look, you'll see the cracks. I no longer wanted to live in fear of touching something and seeing it all fall apart again. I wanted peace. And for the first time in a long time, I had it. She tried to get closer again. She showed up at the place we used to walk on Sundays. She waited outside the market I used to go to. She sent flowers for my birthday with a card that said, "I still love you." But it was all like perfume on a dead flower. Beautiful at first glance, but already lifeless. I was in a different place. Not geographically. In a different state of mind. One where I was chosen every day. One where love didn't need to be tested with desperation, because it was calm, sincere, and constant. I no longer wanted to fight to be seen. I wanted to be truly seen. And someone was finally doing it for me. She, on the other hand, remained. In the same place where everything ended. Trapped in the image of what she had and lost. Alone, revisiting our old photos, the deleted audio, the dinners that no longer happened. Because when regret arrives late, it doesn't transform. It haunts. And hers, I know, remained. Stuck in her throat, in her memory, in the mirror, every time she looks at herself and asks herself, how could I have let slip away the only one who truly loved me? She read my letter days later. The one I'd left with the folder. It wasn't an angry letter. It was just, truth. I told her I loved her like I never thought I could love anyone. That I forgave every silence, every delay, every sign. That I waited longer than I should have. That I fought even when there was no point. That I was loyal, not out of weakness, but by choice. That I tried to be better for her every day. And that still, I wasn't enough. And in the end, I wrote, even with everything, I would have stayed, if you had chosen me. I never got an answer. And I didn't expect to. At this point, words don't change anything. But sometimes I wonder, where exactly does betrayal begin? In the hidden kiss? In the lie told? Or the moment the person by your side stops looking into your eyes and starts seeing you as a detail? Maybe betrayal begins when love subsides, when admiration fades, when gestures become obligation. Maybe it starts slowly, like everything that destroys us little by little. And before we know it, we're already sitting alone, in silence, watching someone smile with someone else and asking ourselves, at what exact moment did I stop being enough? She knows now. But it's too late. And I've finally found what she never knew how to offer, love without games, presence without excuses, and peace. But there's something not even she discovered, something that happened that very day, just before the waiter delivered the pasta, something that changed the course of my life in a way neither she nor her lover could ever have imagined. Welcome to the channel where love is taken seriously and betrayal never is romanticized. Here, no form of infidelity is supported, on the contrary, our stories are fictions created to show, with depth and emotion, how betrayal destroys lives, families and hearts. If you believe in the value of true love, you're in the right place. Get ready. What you're about to hear is a story shocking, intense and unforgettable. Take a deep breath, and good story. They met at a corner cafe, the kind that serves more memories than coffee. It was raining lightly that late afternoon, and as she sheltered under the small canopy, he held out his umbrella as if he didn't think twice, as if he cared even before knowing her name. The gesture wasn't planned, nor was it romantic, it was simply human, instinctive, kind. And perhaps that was precisely why she smiled that light, sincere smile, a smile that didn't say much but would be remembered for years. Her name was Elena. His, Daniel. There were no striking words at that first meeting, just the invitation to share a table while they waited for the rain to stop. Between sips of coffee and shy laughter, the minutes passed as if they had always belonged together. It wasn't an explosive passion, the kind that leaves you breathless and senseless. It was a silent meeting of souls, a leisurely recognition. And when they finally said goodbye, they already knew, though they didn't say it, that it wouldn't end there. The relationship grew slowly, with the maturity of two adults who had lived long enough to understand that love isn't sustained by empty promises or theatrical gestures. Daniel was a discreet, observant man, the kind who prefers to listen before speaking, who notices the details others overlook. He had a non-negotiable sense of justice and a sweet, if sometimes weary, gaze. He worked as an architect, always surrounded by projects and models, but he never let his work take over Elena's space. He believed in giving time, not having it left over. Elena, on the other hand, was intense, spontaneous, full of energy to live and an urgency to feel. A psychologist by training, she dealt daily with the pain of others, which, in a way, made her more empathetic, but also more demanding. With her, words mattered. So did gestures. He was sensitive, but not fragile, he was strong, but carried a discreet melancholy that only Daniel seemed to notice. In the early years, they made an admirable couple. Friends commented on their rapport, how they looked at each other mid-conversation, how they laughed at the same old jokes, how they understood each other without grandstanding. There was no exaggeration, no idealizations, just the truth of everyday life, supermarket lines, silly fights over who would do the dishes, lazy weekends on the couch, impromptu trips that went wrong and became stories to tell. Routine wasn't the villain, it was comfort. And despite the ups and downs, there was something rare between them, a silent commitment to not give up on each other at the first sign of a storm. For a long time, that was enough. Together, they built a simple, soulful home. A two-bedroom apartment with furniture picked from street markets and pictures hung with double-sided tape because she was too anxious to wait for nails. They planted a small vegetable garden on the balcony, not for its usefulness, but for its symbolism. She said she liked seeing something growing near her. And he smiled, watering the plants without question. They had unique habits. Every Wednesday night, they watched the same old movie, as an unspoken tradition. On Sundays, he made them pancake breakfasts, and she played their favorite music while dancing barefoot around the kitchen. They were happy in their own way, with simplicity, with truth. But time has its strange ways. Sometimes, what was once light begins to weigh. Not because it's no longer love, but because the world demands too much, and we begin to store fatigue in place of affection. Daniel started working late, immersed in complex projects that consumed his mental energy. He arrived exhausted, but still made a point of asking how her day had been. Elena, for her part, plunged into a more introspective phase, affected by difficult cases in the office and the feeling that something was missing, a spark, perhaps, a fire that used to burn brighter within her. She began to question her own happiness, the direction of her life, what remained after all certainties were tested. These weren't doubts about her love for Daniel. They were doubts about herself. And, as often happens, the other becomes a mirror of our own emptiness. They tried to maintain their balance. They tried to pretend it was still the same. They continued to have dinner together, still laughed occasionally, still exchanged affection. But something subtle had changed. The conversations became shorter, the kisses quicker, the touching less frequent. And yet, there was affection. There was respect. There was history. Daniel noticed the growing distance, but avoided confronting it. I was afraid to hear what I wasn't ready to accept. I thought it was just a phase. That everything would fall into place. That all it took was time, patience, dedication. Because for him, love was this, choosing to stay even when your heart wavers. Elena, on the other hand, felt trapped between the memory of who she once was and the doubt of who she wanted to be. She wanted to feel the butterflies in her stomach again, the raw passion, the newness that had long since hidden behind routine. But at the same time, I felt guilty. A guilt that grew silently, that made her avoid Daniel's eyes, that made her smile less, speak less, give less of herself. It was like I was in two worlds, the one I had and the one I wanted, and I didn't know how to get out of either of them without hurting someone. There were attempts. Trips for two, impromptu dinners, late-night conversations. Daniel talked about the dreams they still had, the children they planned to have, the bigger house they wanted to build. She listened, always with a polite but distant smile. It wasn't disinterest. It was confusion. And this confusion, slow and dangerous, began to create cracks in a foundation that had previously seemed solid. He didn't notice. He didn't want to notice. He still saw in her the woman he'd fallen in love with, still believed in the strength of what they'd built, still chose her every day. Elena, for her part, began to look outside. Not intentionally, but with need. And need is often fertile ground for bad decisions. Nothing serious had happened yet. No fight, no breakup. Just the subtle, almost imperceptible distance that creeps into the fabric of a relationship. The kind of distance measured not in meters, but in silences. Life went on. They still called each other love, still slept together, still cared about each other. But there was a weariness in Elena's gaze that Daniel pretended not to see. And there was a hope in Daniel's eyes that Elena avoided meeting. They walked together, but in different directions. And they both knew, even without saying it, that they were about to cross an invisible line, a line that, once crossed, would allow no return. And it was at that very point where everything seemed calm but was no longer safe, that fate began to trace the paths that would lead to the greatest rupture in their lives. A moment that had not yet arrived, but was already being prepared in the background of their daily routine. One detail, one gesture, one choice, something simple yet definitive, would come to change everything. And when it did, it would make it clear that sometimes what is lost in seconds took years to build. And that it is not always possible to recover what was left behind in the name of a fleeting doubt. Because true love doesn't die in one fell swoop. It crumbles into pieces, while those involved pretend they can still hold it together. But there are cracks that don't scream. They just grow. Until the day it all comes crashing down. And when that happens, not everyone will be ready to face what's left. Time passed without warning, taking with it the lightness of the early years and leaving in place a routine that seemed increasingly rigid. Daniel continued to believe that difficult times didn't mean the end of a story, just another part of it. He kept up the constant effort to make things work, trying to recapture the habits that once brought them together, like Wednesday movies and Sunday pancakes. Sometimes she accepted with a brief smile, other times she refused, saying she was tired, but he insisted, not with words, but with presence. He was the kind of man who preferred to show love in silent gestures, like making her favorite tea without her asking or tidying up the books scattered around the house after she spent hours seeing patients. Elena noticed everything, but reacted with cold, polite gratitude, as if his actions no longer touched her as they once did. Internally, she felt increasingly trapped in a life she no longer knew was the one she wanted. The hours in the office became more exhausting, the cases more demanding, the days longer. She told herself it was the work, the stress, that she needed time. But deep down, she knew the hole was deeper. She missed something she couldn't name, a restlessness that wouldn't go away, a constant longing to be somewhere else, to be someone else, to feel again what she hadn't felt in a long time. Her admiration for Daniel had transformed into a distant, almost brotherly tenderness. He was good, present, whole. But she no longer saw herself in his eyes as before. And this left her torn between guilt and impulse. It was during a psychology conference in another city that something began to change. She traveled alone, something they had previously avoided whenever possible. He encouraged her to go. He felt it was important for her to be among colleagues, exchanging ideas, and advancing her career. He suspected nothing. He never had. Elena arrived at the hotel tired but grateful for the space. For the first time in a long time, she felt far from her obligations, free from routine. On the second day of the event, she met someone. A fellow speaker, foreign, charismatic, younger, full of strong opinions and a seductive tongue. They chatted during breaks, laughed together, exchanged ideas on the panel topics, and at the end of the evening, he invited her to dinner. She hesitated, but went. She told herself it was nothing special, just dinner, just two professionals talking. But something inside her was already stirring. She felt seen differently, as if she were being discovered by someone who didn't know her history, her habits, her flaws. This, for her, was new. And the novelty has a dangerous sheen. She returned home with a discomfort in her chest. Nothing physical had happened, nothing that could be considered a concrete betrayal. But something inside her had changed. The dinner, the look, the laughter, the tension that hung in the air, all of it stayed with her like a perfume that never fades. Daniel welcomed her with flowers and her favorite meal. She smiled, thanked him, kissed his cheek, and headed to the shower. And in the silence of the shower, she cried. Not for what she had done. For what she had thought about doing. And yet, it wasn't enough to stop her from replying to the message her colleague had sent that same night, asking if she had arrived safely. Their exchange of messages intensified. They began talking every day. First about work, then about trivial things, then about life, about dreams, about frustrations. He was funny, engaging, asked deep questions, listened attentively. And even from a distance, he seemed closer than the man who slept beside her every night. Daniel, oblivious to everything, continued making plans. He talked about a possible trip at the end of the month, showed her photos of a house in the countryside where they could spend a weekend. Elena smiled and nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. And with each passing day, the distance between them grew wider, even though they were physically side by side. Conversations with the other man turned into video calls, confessions, sighs. Soon, they arranged to meet again, this time without professional excuses. And what was once just an emotional connection soon became physical. At the first touch, Elena felt guilty, but she didn't stop. The intensity of the moment, the feeling of being desired, of being the center of someone's world, made her forget everything. It was only later, returning home, with his scent still on her skin, that reality hit her hard. In the following days, she tried to act normal. She made coffee, commented on the traffic, read messages on her phone, hiding the screen. Daniel didn't notice, or pretended not to notice. Maybe he'd already noticed something, but he preferred to believe it was just fatigue, that everything would soon return to normal. He still believed in the power of us. I still thought the small distances were fleeting. Elena, on the other hand, was increasingly entangled in a cycle of lies that grew like an impossible stain. Her visits to the doctor became longer, her encounters with her lover more frequent. She always returned home with a lump in her throat, torn between the comfort of a lovingly built home and the desire for something that felt more alive, more urgent. Gradually, her behavior changed. She began to get irritated over small things, respond indifferently, and avoid deeper conversations. Daniel tried to understand, tried to reconnect, but it was like knocking on a door that wouldn't open. One night, he waited for her for dinner, and she didn't return. She said she'd had an unexpected problem with a patient and needed to stay longer in the office. He believed her. As he always did. He prepared the meal, warmed the wine, sat at the table, and waited. Alone. When she arrived, dinner was already cold. He asked if everything was okay, she said yes, and went upstairs to her room. Daniel stood there, staring at the untouched plate, with a feeling he couldn't yet name, but which was already weighing on his chest. The following weeks were silent. She grew more and more distant. He grew more and more confused. Until one night, by chance, he saw a notification on her phone. A message with a pet name, a phrase you wouldn't say to a coworker. His heart raced. The ground seemed to fall away. But he didn't react. He didn't question. He simply stared at her with a silence that hurt more than any words. Elena noticed the look, tried to hide it, but the damage was already done. For the first time, he knew. For the first time, love became concrete doubt. He said nothing that night. They slept in the same bed, facing opposite sides, each with their own ghosts. In the following days, Daniel began to observe her differently. Her outings, her schedules, her hidden messages. He began to piece things together. There was no longer room for denial. The love was still there, but it was bleeding. He decided not to confront it. Not yet. He wanted to understand how far it went. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. And so, one random afternoon, he followed in her footsteps. He saw her car park, saw her hurriedly get out, saw the other man waiting. He saw the embrace. The kiss. The intimacy. And there, standing across the street, he knew for sure. There was no more doubt. There was no more maybe. The betrayal was real. The image burned itself into his retina like a scar. His heart ached, but his mind was clear. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply took a deep breath and left. That night, he prepared the folder. He gathered the documents. He enclosed the letter. He knew this wouldn't just be a legal separation. It would be the end of a life, a home, a future he'd dreamed of alone for too long. He also knew she had no idea what was about to happen. Because for her, it was still possible to keep everything. The lover, the comfort, the marriage. But for him, there was a line that, once crossed, there was no turning back. And that night, alone, sitting at the table with the folder ready before him, he realized something she would never know, something that would change everything. The rain pattered softly against the restaurant's windows, blending with the low instrumental track that filled the room with an almost cruel calm. The dining room was spacious and elegant, with yellowish lights hanging over the tables and discreet waiters hovering between false smiles and heavy trays. The place where, years ago, Daniel and Elena celebrated their first wedding anniversary. The same restaurant where she now laughed softly at another man, leaning forward with a look full of desire and familiarity. The same place where he, from across the room, watched in silence. There was no more trembling. There was no more anger. Her heart no longer raced, for the shock had passed. What remained now was clarity. A silent and definitive pain, like that of a doctor who, after indisputable tests, confirms what he already knows: there is no cure. Daniel handed the waiter the carefully organized folder. Inside were the divorce papers, signed by him, accompanied by a letter. No insults, no bitter outbursts. Just precise, pointed words, like a serene final point. He asked the waiter to bring it to her table with a single instruction: deliver it when she finished laughing. He wanted her to savor what she had chosen to the last. He wanted this moment of pleasure to be the last before she collapsed. He sat for a few more seconds, watching unnoticed. Then he slowly rose and left the room without looking back, like someone closing the last page of a book that was once their favorite. Elena only noticed Daniel's presence when the waiter, already at the table, placed the folder down and, with a whisper that sounded like a stab, said, "It's your husband's." Her smile froze. The fingers holding the glass faltered. Her lover, who had been relaxed until then, shifted in his chair, casting a worried glance at the dark envelope on the table. She couldn't move. Inside, her stomach sank in icy waves. He opened the folder with trembling hands, and there they were, the papers. The signatures. And the letter. She read it all right there. Page by page, as if each word were a heartbeat in her chest. The silence around her became deafening. The last lines of the letter hit her harder than any scream. Even with everything, I would have stayed, if you had chosen me. When she finished reading, her eyes were welling up, and her lover in front of her, uncomfortable, cleared his throat as he put his cell phone in his pocket. He said he had to leave, that he didn't know exactly what was happening, that she should resolve it calmly, but that he didn't want to be involved in a marital drama. He stood up, without looking at her properly, and disappeared between the tables. Elena was left alone, facing an open folder and a reality that ran down her face like smeared makeup. In the following days, she tried to contact him. She called dozens of times. She sent messages, audio messages, and emails. No response. She visited his office, where she was informed that Daniel had taken an early vacation. She visited his house, but it was locked and silent. Everything seemed too clean, too tidy, as if he had erased all traces. She began going to the places they used to frequent, hoping to see him. Nothing. Only memories. Only the echo of conversations they once had. And just when she was about to give up, a mutual friend replied to her message, saying he would be willing to see her. Just once. She awaited that meeting as if awaiting judgment. She knew there was no justification that could heal the damage, but she still had to try. She needed to see him. She needed to apologize, even if it didn't work. When he opened the door, Elena almost didn't recognize him. He wasn't the bitter Daniel she'd imagined. There was no coldness, no anger. There was a strange, disconcerting serenity. She tried to smile, but he only pointed to the sofa. They sat in silence for a moment too long. Until she broke the ice with the only word she could muster, "I'm sorry." He looked at her with tired, but not hard, eyes. He said he didn't hate her, that he held no grudge. He said he understood, in a way, what happened. He said he also felt distant, forgotten, less desired. But that would never justify breaking the bond. That true love doesn't demand perfection, but it does demand loyalty. That her mistake wasn't falling in love with someone else, but staying with him while she already belonged to someone else. He said betrayal isn't just a kiss, it's absence, silence, a lie repeated. She cried. She tried to explain, but he interrupted with calm words, a tone that didn't demand answers. Until she asked if he was already with someone. And that was when the silence changed. He hesitated for a second. Then he answered yes. But there was something in his tone that wasn't relief, nor pride. It was something else. She persisted. She wanted to know who. How. When. And he took a deep breath before answering. He said some truths only reveal themselves when we're ready. That he hadn't looked for anyone, that he hadn't planned to move on so quickly. But that one day, right after signing the papers, he ran into an old friend in the grocery line. A woman he'd known for years, who had always been discreet, kind, present in life's small moments. Someone who never tried to get inappropriately close, even when everyone knew there was a silent connection between them. And that in that line, with a bag of fruit in her hand and a shy smile on her face, she simply asked, "Are you okay?" And for the first time in a long time, he answered sincerely, "Now, I'm starting to be." Elena stared at him, trying to process. She knew that woman. She knew who she was. She was her childhood best friend, the same one she'd broken ties with years ago out of pride, out of envy, out of feeling threatened by something that never really happened. Elena laughed, but it wasn't a light laugh. It was a laugh of pain, of shock. She asked if he loved her. Daniel didn't answer right away. He simply said, "She chose me. When no one else saw value in me, she saw me." And in that moment, Elena understood. She understood that she had lost more than a husband. She had lost the chance to be chosen by him again. She had lost the respect of an old friendship. She had lost time that would never return. She had lost the man who loved her with the depth that only those who care without fanfare can love. She tried to fight, saying she wanted to rebuild, that she was sorry, that she now saw everything clearly. But he interrupted her, this time firmly. He said she already had forgiveness. But that starting over was another story. That he couldn't go back to a place where he no longer belonged. That love, for him, wasn't a cycle of comings and goings, it was a commitment that, once broken, couldn't be remade. He said he wanted her to be okay. That she would truly find herself. And that one day, perhaps, she would understand that her mistake wasn't just cheating. It was not knowing the value of what she had until she realized it was no longer there. Elena left that house in silence. There was no goodbye, no hug. Just the sound of the door closing behind her, and the weight of what could never be fixed. On the sidewalk, she looked up at the cloudy sky and, for the first time, felt what Daniel had felt in that restaurant, a definitive emptiness. An echoing absence. An end with no return. But there was still something she didn't know. Something that had been hidden from the beginning. A subtle yet brutal detail. Something that was in that letter she read so quickly, so desperately, that she missed it. Something that explained why Daniel had managed to free himself so quickly, with such certainty. Something that revealed that, even in silence, he had already made his decision long before handing over that folder. A few days passed since their conversation. The world continued to spin outside, indifferent to the silent collapse occurring within Elena. She woke up every day in the apartment they had shared, now filled only with absence. The paintings on the walls, once full of meaning, seemed like works from a past that no longer belonged to her. The space he left wasn't physical, it was emotional, it was existential. The oversized bed, the silence between the walls, his scent slowly fading from the sheets, all of this now bore witness to what she had destroyed with her own hands. Elena, once restless and impulsive, now seemed paralyzed. She couldn't eat, couldn't work, could barely talk to anyone without feeling embarrassed. The world had changed color. And nothing, absolutely nothing, made sense without Daniel there. The revelation that he was with another woman had been a hard blow, but not enough to kill her inside. What completely dismantled her was knowing that the woman in question was someone who had been part of her history. Someone she had pushed away out of pure pride. Who she had discarded as if she didn't matter. And now, this same woman filled the spaces that had once been hers. Daniel wasn't just trying to move on. He had found someone who chose him with conviction. Who made him laugh again. Who saw in him what she, for so long, pretended not to see. The truth Elena refused to accept was that he no longer waited for her. That he had loved until the end. But now he was loving differently. In a different way. And with someone else. That afternoon, as the windows let in a timid sunlight, Elena searched the house for anything left of him. Not to bring him back. But to understand, to try to connect, even if it was with an old version of him. It was then that she found, among forgotten papers at the bottom of a drawer, a copy of the letter he'd left with the divorce papers. She'd read it before, but this time, as she read it, her eyes stopped on a passage she'd previously overlooked. It wasn't a long passage. It was a short note, almost like a postscript. Before you betrayed me, I already knew I was alone here. What you don't know, is that I forgave you before I even realized it. Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. The sentence echoed louder than any scream that could have come out of his mouth that day. She stood, pacing back and forth, trying to understand what that meant. Forgiveness before discovery. How was that possible? How could someone forgive before being completely hurt? It was unsettling. Because it destroyed any excuse she could use. She hadn't been betrayed by indifference, nor by a lack of love. She had been betrayed by her own inability to perceive a love that, even wounded, remained standing, waiting for her. And even after everything, he had already forgiven her. Not because she deserved it. But because he didn't want to carry any weight other than that of his own truth. Driven by an almost feverish restlessness, Elena left the house. She needed to talk to him. Not to get back together, because that path was no longer there. But because she needed to tell him she understood. She needed, for the first time in years, to be honest with him without the filter of guilt or manipulation. She simply wanted to apologize properly, without expecting anything in return. She knew she wouldn't be well received. But she went anyway. Along the way, every corner seemed to scream memories. The cafe where they met, the store where they chose their first sofa, the park where he proposed. Every corner of the city was a reminder of what could have been eternal. Approaching his new home, she hesitated. She considered turning back. But then she saw, across the street, Daniel leaving with the woman who now occupied the place she had lost. They were holding hands, laughing lightly, as if the past no longer held sway. Elena didn't hide. She stood still. And his eyes found hers. There was a second of silence. A second that held years of history. He didn't let go of her hand. He didn't look away. But he didn't smile either. She approached slowly. He stopped. The woman beside him respected his space, gently releasing his hand and saying she would wait for him in the car. When they were alone, Elena took a deep breath. And said what she needed to say. That she understood now. That she was too lost to see. That it wasn't a lack of love that made her walk away, but an excess of fear. That she had made a mistake. That she had hurt. That she had lied. But her biggest mistake was thinking love was replaceable. That he was replaceable. She said she wasn't there to ask for his return, or for forgiveness. She was there to look him in the eyes and acknowledge the pain she had caused. No excuses. No justifications. Just that. Daniel listened in silence. When she finished, her eyes were watery, but her expression was firm. He said he was grateful for her honesty. That those words came too late, but they were still valuable. That it was good to hear them. That they brought some relief. But they didn't change anything. That what was between them was real, strong, sincere, until it wasn't. That he learned from the pain. That he didn't shut himself off. That he was reborn. And that now, he was exactly where he should be. With someone who saw him completely. Who chose him in the little things. Who didn't make him doubt himself. Elena just nodded. She knew. She felt. And then she asked the question that still hurt more than all the others, "Do you still love me?" He looked her in the eye, without looking away, and answered, "I love who you were. But who you are today, no longer fits what I need." It was like a final blow. But also like a release. There was nothing more to say. There was no more subtext. She smiled, her eyes brimming, turned, and walked away. And as she walked alone down the sidewalk, she understood something she would never forget. Sometimes, the greatest punishment of betrayal isn't abandonment or judgment. It's knowing you had something true, rare, intense, and didn't know how to take care of it. It's seeing the other person move on, stronger, happier, more whole, and realizing you've been stuck in time, surrounded by ghosts of your own making. The weight of regret lies not only in what's lost, but in what's realized too late. As she drove away, Daniel returned to the car, where his new companion was waiting for him with a calm smile. She held his hand again. And there, without needing to say a single word, he knew it had all been worth it. That every tear, every loss, every silence, had brought him exactly where he deserved to be. Because love, when true, can even be destroyed. But when it's reborn, it's always stronger. And always more just. Night fell with a strange tranquility after the encounter between the two. A dense silence seemed to settle over everything around them, as if even time respected the end of that story. Elena walked back home slowly, in no hurry to arrive, as if carrying on her shoulders not only her own mistakes but also the irreversible knowledge that there was nothing more to be done. Within her, the certainty that that last conversation had clearly sealed the end of a story she herself had long kept suspended out of pride, out of cowardice, out of fear of looking in the mirror and recognizing that she had destroyed something precious, not for lack of love, but for not knowing how to deal with her own dissatisfaction. When she got home, she didn't turn on the lights, left her shoes in the middle of the living room, and sat on the floor, with her back against the cold wall, trying to process everything she had experienced in the last few weeks. The crying that came was not scandalous, it was calm, dry, almost silent, the kind of crying that does not seek comfort, but comes from the internal recognition that one has lost oneself and there is no way back. Meanwhile, Daniel was on the other side of town, but in a completely different time. For him, the chapter had closed with the dignity of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard, nor hate to move forward. That night, he had dinner with his new wife by his side. The conversation was light, flowing naturally, and even when they talked about ordinary topics, there was a mutual respect between them, a clear choice to be there, to be present. There was no urgency, no burden, no constant need to prove himself. There was surrender. After dinner, she suggested they take a walk before heading home. They walked side by side, and he, for the first time in a long time, felt no fear of the future. There was no longer that feeling of treading on shaky ground. He was convinced he had made the best possible decision for himself, not out of revenge, but out of deserving. The next morning, Elena woke with her face still streaked with tears, but with a clarity she had never experienced before. She had become a lonely woman in her own skin, but she finally understood she could no longer run from it. She picked up her phone, typed a long message to Daniel, but didn't send it. She deleted it. She started another, shorter one, and deleted it too. The truth was, nothing she said now would change how he felt. Nothing would bring him back. And deep down, she no longer expected that. She just wanted to be able to forgive herself one day, even if she didn't know how. She remembered the friend who was now with him, their old relationship, and how, out of insecurity and jealousy, she had destroyed that bond. There was no one to blame. Everything that had broken in her life stemmed from the choices she had made alone. The moral dilemma growing within Elena was greater than the loss of Daniel. It was about her own identity, about the woman she had become and the woman she pretended to be. She began to mentally review all the decisions that had led her to this point, the emotional neglect, the silent disrespect, the betrayal justified by a need she never dared confess, not even to herself. And most painfully, realizing there was someone who always chose her, even when she became difficult to love. Someone who saw in her what she herself didn't see. And instead of caring, she demanded more, expected more, and when he had already given himself completely, she turned her face away. Daniel, on the other hand, was going through a process of rebuilding that was anything but romantic. It was silent, made up of small steps, simple days, and a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The new woman in his life didn't try to erase the past or compete with him. She simply listened to him, offered her presence without demands, and that was enough. They had their own routines now, late afternoon walks, shared coffees, comfortable silences. Daniel was beginning to experience a mature love, without the impulses and desperation of times past. A love that was built slowly, with respect. He knew he would never be the same man he was before. He knew there were scars, marks that would stay with him for a long time. But that didn't stop him from trying. It didn't stop him from loving again. Meanwhile, Elena decided to seek help. She returned to therapy, not as a professional, but as a patient. She needed to understand her choices, her failings, her shadows. For the first time, she wasn't trying to explain herself. She wanted to understand herself. The sessions were intense, painful. She relived old memories, confronted truths she'd always avoided. She began writing. Not letters to him, but texts to herself. About guilt, forgiveness, choices. It was a slow process. There were days when she wanted to disappear, days when shame weighed more heavily than anything. But there were also moments of lucidity, when she could look back without completely hating herself, and glimpse, even from afar, the woman she could still become. Not for anyone. For herself. Some mutual friends gradually reconnected. Not to judge, but because they understood that every story has nuances that only those who experience it know. They listened to what she said with empathy, but without condescension. And this helped her. He began to accept that there was no way to change what had been done. But there was, indeed, a way to honor what she lost, by becoming better. For future relationships, for future encounters, for new versions of herself. One day, she received an unusual invitation, a lecture on emotional health in the workplace, organized by an institution she admired. She knew Daniel would be there, as a participant. And for a moment, she considered refusing. But something inside her told her she should go. Not to see him, but to test herself. To see if she could be in the same room as him without sinking into regret. On the day of the lecture, she arrived early, sat in the back row, and kept a low profile. When he entered, he didn't notice her immediately. He was smiling, accompanied. He seemed well. Truly well. And in that moment, Elena understood that she had truly lost him completely. But she also realized something deeper: she had survived. The talk continued, intense and moving. She spoke about choices, about emotional health, about how we are responsible for everything we create, relationships, bonds, ruptures. She spoke with authority, with pain, and with truth. At the end, she received applause. And Daniel, for a moment, looked in her direction. There was no hurt in his eyes. No sadness. There was respect. Elena lowered her eyes, but felt a peace she hadn't known. This was the beginning of something. Not a fresh start with him. But a fresh start with herself. As they were leaving, they passed each other. He smiled. She smiled back. And for the first time in a long time, that gesture didn't hurt. It was simply what it was, a brief encounter between two people who, despite everything, had learned a lot from each other. They didn't exchange words. They didn't need to. They had already said everything. She continued walking alone to her car, and realized that the loneliness no longer hurt as much as before. It was a new companion, one she could now call her own. There was room within her for rebuilding. There was a strength that, despite all the losses, remained intact. And even if the love she destroyed never returned, perhaps there was still time to create something new. To live differently. To be better. Because when everything is lost, and yet one moves forward, something essential is reborn. And it is this something that begins to grow, ever so slowly, when one has the courage to face what one has done, and even more, the courage to change. But time, that eternal teller of silences, still had something in store. Something neither Elena nor Daniel expected. One final twist in this story, one that would come not to reopen wounds, but to seal, once and for all, the true meaning of their shared experience. In the week following the silent reunion at the lecture, the days passed like loose leaves carried by the wind, unpredictable, yet inevitable. Elena, who had grown accustomed to the burden of being alone, began to discover the value of recognizing herself in the small daily choices. She had returned to places she had previously avoided, no longer in an attempt to reconnect with Daniel, but as a way to rebuild, to rediscover pieces of herself that had been erased or neglected during the years her identity was hidden behind the title of wife, of exemplary professional, of a woman who had it all under control. Nothing was under control anymore, and, curiously, this disorder brought her a new form of balance. She learned to navigate her flaws honestly, without victimhood, facing her reflection in the mirror with the courage she never had in the years she preferred to run from herself. She began to sleep better, to eat with pleasure, to take care of herself not out of vanity, but out of respect. And, in the midst of this slow process, a version of herself was born that didn't exist before, a woman without excuses, without fantasies, without masks. One cloudy morning, while leafing through a poetry book in a local bookstore, she chanced upon Daniel's mother. For a second, she considered retreating, but something inside her wouldn't let her. She approached, with calm steps, and greeted her with a shy smile. The woman watched her for a moment, surprised, and returned the greeting kindly. They chatted right there, among shelves of old books. They didn't immediately touch on the past, they talked about the weather, about the neighbor's grandchildren, about the bookstore, as if warming up a conversation before touching on the wound. Until Elena, with a downcast look, asked if Daniel was okay. The answer was direct, blunt, he's at peace. And that, though not an attack, hurt more than any accusation. Peace was what she had taken from him. And now, he had rebuilt that peace away from her. Still, his mother didn't leave. They continued talking for a few more minutes. Finally, she placed her hand over Elena's and said, "You made a mistake, yes. But I also know how much you loved. Maybe if you'd been honest with him before, things would be different. But don't think he hates you. Daniel just chose to live differently." Elena simply nodded, her eyes moist, and thanked him. They went in opposite directions, but that conversation touched her deeply. She hadn't expected understanding, much less affection. But that small gesture showed that, despite the pain, life went on, and there was room even for bridges to be rebuilt, even if they never led to the same destination as before. Months passed. Life was transforming into something new, with different colors, different rhythms. Daniel and his new partner decided to move in together. It wasn't an impulsive move. It was decided calmly, maturely, and through dialogue. Both came from difficult backgrounds and knew that true love isn't measured by the intensity of feelings, but by the consistency of choices. She wasn't trying to heal him. He wasn't trying to escape the past. They simply walked together, building something real, imperfect, but deeply honest. Their conversations were full of listening. The silences were comfortable. Daniel no longer woke up with the weight of what he'd experienced, but with the lightness of someone who is exactly where he should be. There was gratitude in his eyes, not for having been betrayed, but for having survived. For being reborn whole. During this time, Elena dedicated herself to a new project. She began writing about the complexities of modern relationships, about loss, about the choices that define us. She created a small support group for women going through marital crises but didn't know how to deal with their feelings. She didn't hold herself up as a role model. Quite the opposite. She courageously acknowledged the mistakes she'd made. And it was precisely this vulnerability that made her an inspiration to so many others. Her words didn't come from theory, they came from the flesh. From the ground she knew so well. And, little by little, the pain began to transform into a mission. One day, she received an unexpected message. It was from Daniel. Short, direct, polite. He said he had read one of the articles she had published in an online column and that, despite everything, he was happy to see her use her experience to help others. There was no resentment in the message. There was recognition. Elena stared at the screen for a few minutes, unsure how to respond. Finally, she simply wrote, "Thank you. I hope you are truly well." And he replied, "I am. And I hope you are too." The exchange ended there, and that was enough. It was mature. No pending issues. No reopening of wounds. It was, finally, a true closure. One Sunday afternoon, while walking through a street market, Elena felt something different in the air. It wasn't longing. It was a kind of good nostalgia, like someone revisiting a painful memory and, for the first time, being able to smile. She knew she would never experience that love again. But she also knew that, despite its end, that love had been real. And that it doesn't disappear. No matter the time, the choices, the consequences. There are loves that leave their mark like invisible tattoos, that stay with us even after the story ends. She sat on a random bench, watching the movement around her. Children running, couples exchanging affection, people alone savoring their own silence. Everything seemed so full of life. For the first time, she didn't envy others' happiness. She felt hope. She wasn't completely well yet, but she was moving. And that was enough. Life, with its mysterious way of teaching, had forced each of them to follow a very different, yet essential, path. Daniel, through pain, discovered his own strength, his dignity, his ability to love again without carrying trauma. Elena, through loss, found her truth, her humanity, and the urgency to live authentically. Neither of them was the same anymore. And this was, perhaps, the greatest justice of all they had experienced. Both were forced to transform. At a dinner with friends, months later, Daniel was asked, in a relaxed manner, what he would do if he could go back in time. He thought for a few seconds and replied with impressive serenity, "I would have chosen myself sooner. I would have realized sooner that no love should exist at the expense of our own peace." The sentence was spoken without weight, without pain. Simply with wisdom. His companion, at his side, smiled. She discreetly touched his hand and changed the subject. But that sentence stuck in everyone's minds for a while. Elena, at one of the support group meetings, heard a woman ask, "Do you think someone can love again after being cheated on?" She took a deep breath, thought about Daniel, thought about everything they'd been through, and replied, "Yes." But the real question is, can we love ourselves after cheating? Because if we can, then maybe we can start over. The silence that followed was shocking. And there, she realized she'd found her answer, too. They had both moved on. But something inside them would always carry the story they shared. Not as a burden, nor as a debt. But as a living reminder of what true love can be, and what it demands: presence, daily choice, and above all, truth. Everything that was missing for love to survive. Everything that, now, finally, they both understood. And even if their paths never crossed again, each knew they had left a mark on the other. And that mark, however painful, was real. And that was what, in the end, made it all so human. Time passed with the relentless delicacy of someone who waits for no one. The seasons changed, and with them the landscapes. Daniel's life had taken on new contours, quieter, but finally stable. He and his new partner had moved to a house in the countryside, far from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. There was no luxury, no excess, just what was necessary to live with dignity and peace. They farmed together, tended the house with their own hands, and laughed for simple reasons. There was no euphoria, but there was consistency. And that was what he needed after all this. For the first time, Daniel didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone, not even to himself. The pain he experienced was no longer a wound, it was memory. And memory, even when painful, when matured, ceases to be a prison and becomes a learning experience. The scars were there, invisible but present, and they were part of who he had become. Not a bitter man, but a man who learned to preserve himself. A man who had allowed himself to suffer, but who did not allow himself to be paralyzed by suffering. Who did not allow lost love to prevent possible love. On a warm spring afternoon, while watering the plants in the backyard, he received a call. It was his lawyer. He informed him that, finally, the property division process had been finalized. There was nothing left pending between him and Elena. Nothing legal, nothing emotional. It was official closure. A definitive end. He thanked her, hung up, and continued watering the garden. He didn't celebrate. But he didn't feel sad either. Just the knowledge that the cycle was complete. And there was something profoundly just about it all. Elena, for her part, continued with her transformed routine. She no longer sought redemption in grand acts, nor did she expect life to return what she had lost. She understood that some choices cost more than we imagine and that regret is not a key that opens old doors, but rather a mirror that forces us to see what we would rather ignore. She continued with her support group, increasingly committed to helping other women avoid repeating their mistakes. She wrote articles, gave lectures, and even though many saw her as an example of overcoming adversity, she never allowed herself to be placed on that pedestal. He knew what he had done wasn't heroic. It was the bare minimum. It was simply taking responsibility for himself with maturity and trying to transform guilt into purpose. But inside, there were moments when the silence still weighed heavily. At night, lying alone in the bed where once there was so much love, she remembered the small gestures, the Sunday mornings, the glances that never returned. And there were days when the tears returned. Without drama, without despair. Just a reminder that some losses never completely stop hurting. They just become bearable. One afternoon, Elena received an unexpected message. Not from Daniel, but from his current partner. The text was polite, direct, and at the same time deeply sensitive. She said she respected the history she and Daniel had, that she knew everything that happened, but that she didn't feel the need to compete with the past. She simply wanted to say that, despite everything, she admired Elena's courage in facing life head-on. He said he didn't agree with what she did, but understood the human complexity behind it. And he concluded by saying he hoped one day they could meet without burden, only with respect. Elena read the message several times before responding. And when she did, it was with a lump in her throat. He said he didn't expect understanding, but would be grateful. And that he truly wished her and Daniel happiness. That she would care for him as he deserved. That she would choose him every day, as she herself had failed to do. And so, with a simple exchange of words, two women bound by a painful history managed to transform resentment into respect. And that, for Elena, was more important than any reconciliation. Time passed. Daniel published a book, a novel based on his own journey, written with the subtlety of someone who doesn't want to expose, but rather to reflect. The work spoke of love, choices, and the courage to start over. It gained attention in literary circles, not for its fame, but for the truth it carried. Elena read the book. She wept silently on the last page. Not because she still expected anything from him, but because she saw herself portrayed with such sensitivity. There was no revenge between the lines. There was humanity. And this made her understand, once and for all, that the love they experienced was real. That the pain it caused didn't kill the beauty of what existed. And this, while it didn't erase anything, brought unexpected comfort. Years later, at a conference on relationships and emotional health, the two were invited to the same panel. They were there as experts, as different voices from the same experience. When they saw each other backstage, before going on stage, there was no awkwardness. They greeted each other with a brief, sincere hug. They exchanged knowing glances, no longer passionate, but filled with a respect that only those who have been deeply hurt can have. On stage, they spoke with maturity. They told their sides of the story, without attacking, without becoming inflamed. Simply telling the truth with the calm of those who have overcome. The audience listened in silence, many of them moved. And at the end, when the applause came, they both looked at each other once more. There were no more questions there. Only peace. After the event, they walked together to the exit. They talked about the book, about new projects, about life as it is now. They laughed, reminiscing about old things with the lightness that only time brings. Before saying goodbye, Daniel said something he'd kept in mind for a long time: "Thank you for leaving me. I only managed to be this man because I had to rebuild myself." Elena smiled, her eyes brimming with tears, and replied, "And I only managed to be this woman after I lost you." A brief silence sealed the moment. Then they went their separate ways, certain that, despite the end, what they experienced together shaped who they are today. And that, ultimately, was the greatest form of love they could offer each other. If you've made it this far, you've definitely felt everything this story carries. Now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? What was the most memorable moment for you? Leave your comment below. And if you like strong, real and emotional stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss any of the next ones. This story shows us something powerful: betrayal doesn't just destroy the other person, it destroys the traitor himself, because it breaks something inside that is often impossible to rebuild, when someone chooses to lie, cheat, or hurt, they're not just ending a relationship. They're killing the trust, the respect, and the home that was built, and there is not always a way back. Remember, this channel does not support, encourage, or romanticize any type of cheating. Here, we tell stories like this to show what really happens when you play with true feelings. Because true love deserves to be cared for, chosen and respected every day.